Welcome to 1+1, where my guest is entrepreneur and adventurer Dick Smith. As a boy, he wasn't much good at anything except being a scout, but he got lucky and wealthy through his car radio business, becoming a self-made multi-millionaire with a taste for adventure and a belief in the value of responsible risk-taking.
I'm crossing the Arctic Circle. Yippee!
Gary Johnson.
He's a philanthropist who's passionate about a sustainable population, and his latest book is Ball's Pyramid, about climbing the world's tallest sea stack near Lord Howe Island. Dick Smith, it's a pleasure to have you on the program.
Jane, it's great to be here.
Dick, I heard your wife say in a program some years ago that you were not a big risk taker, and that surprised me. What did she mean by that?
Well, I try and call myself a responsible risk taker, or I calculate the risk, and I'm actually quite a coward, and I do get frightened on some of the adventures I've been on.
Give me an example.
Well, probably the riskiest thing I've ever done is the balloon flights, one across Australia and one from New Zealand to Australia. With a balloon, you'll notice if you go in a commercial balloon, it's either early in the morning or late at night, and if the wind comes up, they quickly land the balloon. But if you're going to fly across a continent, you have no idea what the wind's going to be like. And on the trip across Australia, we were doing 160 kilometres an hour in the jet stream, and the balloon weighs about 2.5 tonnes, and we knew we had to get it down with virtually no wind. Now, it was frightening because if we'd actually come down and the wind was 20 or 30 knots, we could have been killed. Luckily, by the time we got across the Great Dividing Range, the wind had dropped, and very lucky. So part of my responsible risk-taking is being lucky.
Okay, because that's interesting, because many people would look at your life and say, whether it's starting up businesses or adventures or taking a particular stand, those all involve risk.
Yes, they do. In fact, I need that risk. It's adrenaline pumping excitement. And to me, when I flew solo around the world in a helicopter, when I started to get across an ocean in a single-engine helicopter with no floats, I've got a little life jacket on, that's exciting, but I was frightened at different times. And I remember thinking, if ever I get out of this segment alive, when I was crossing the Atlantic, the weather was so bad, I was winding in and out through snowstorms, and I thought, if ever I get out of this and I can land, I'll put the helicopter into a container and ship it back home and come up with some excuse. But in fact, when I actually landed at the place and went in and had a cup of coffee, after about an hour I thought, oh, it wasn't so bad after all. And the human psyche, I think, is like that you're frightened at times, but then when you look back, you think, oh, it wasn't quite as bad. And so then you go on, and that's what happened with me.
So when you were growing up in East Roseville in Sydney, your dad initially worked, I think, for Angus and Robertson. Your mum looked after you and your sister. What effect did it have on the household when I think your dad started his own business and the business didn't work?
Yes, it was a terrible thing. My dad was always, I mean, I suppose you'd call us working class family, but he was a salesman and then became a sales manager and then opened his own printing business. And within 3 months, I think there was the famous Menzies credit squeeze, and it went completely broke. He lost everything. Now, he just ended up in bed. He had a complete nervous breakdown, so he just lay in bed for 6 months. My mum had to go out and work. She'd never done that. She was a homemaker, a housewife. And I remember we didn't have enough money for the normal food we'd had, and I came back one day from Chatswood and said, oh, you can get chops called hogget chops or something, and they're cheaper. And so it was quite an eye-opener for me. The interesting thing was that my dad obviously wasn't a good entrepreneur, because he tried and he failed, but by complete fluke I was. And so luckily he lived long enough to see that I was successful as a businessman. Because as a kid I was hopeless at school, and my parents used to say to each other, whatever will happen to Dick? They were very worried about me.
Yeah, so did you lack confidence as a kid, knowing that you weren't particularly brilliant? And I think you had a speech defect as well, didn't you?
Yeah, I think I had an inferiority complex, but in those days, I suppose you'd say I was even bullied. I mean, the teacher put me out in front of the class to say my name, and I said Dick Fish and Dick Miff because I couldn't say Smith. And everyone laughed, and finally she sent me to the principal. I think I was about 8 years of age, and the principal luckily rang my mother, and my mum said, oh, he can't say S. I mean, these days they'd send you to a speech therapist. In those days, you're just in with it. And I was hopeless at school. I couldn't learn. Maybe I had a bit of dyslexia or something. And so I ended up leaving school at 15, working in a factory, and basically thought, well, I'm not going to be able to get anywhere in life. But luckily, I managed to prove that wrong.
And you'd always been, at least since the age of 8, you'd been a Cub Scout.
Yep.
I think pretty much until you were in your mid-20s, you won one of scouting's highest awards. Did that somehow compensate for the confidence you didn't get at school?
Yeah, I think the Cubs, the scouting movement had the greatest influence. It's the greatest youth leadership movement in the world. And also it taught you, I remember the Scout promise, on my honour, I'll do my duty. So it talked about honour and duty, quite quaint these days. It talked about helping people at all times. And so that was ingrained in me. Also, it allowed me to be an individual.
So by the time that you and your mates climbed Ball's Pyramid, which is this incredible sea stack near-ish to Lord Howe Island, that was 1964. So you were 20 at the time. Would that have been the biggest risk you'd ever taken?
Oh, yes. When I look back, I mean, see, today, if a young scout of 20 years of age said to the scoutmaster, oh, I'm going to organise a charter boat to sail out to Ball's Pyramid, 400 miles out, we're going to climb it, he'd say, hold on, we've got to get in touch with headquarters, we've got to get approval, and you'd never get approval. It would be deemed too dangerous. In those days, we didn't even tell the group scoutmaster. We managed to get our rover leader to come up with the money. He was a wealthy doctor, an anaesthetist, to charter the boat. And here we are, 20-year-old Boy Scouts, to sail out to Ball's Pyramid, incredibly risky. The voyage itself, 72 hours. None of us had sailed before.
In November 1964, the Ketch Taihoa set sail from Sydney with expedition members from varied walks of life, all having two things in common: an association with the scouting movement and a keenness to play each one his part in what was to come.
You had to jump into shark-infested
We had to jump into the water
waters.
and then swim and then climb up on a ledge, and these waves coming in and out. And when I looked, forgetting the climbing, which was risky, just getting there was incredibly risky. But that formed me, that allowed me to learn responsible risk-taking. And I think it's so important today that that should still be encouraged, because not only is it discouraged, in fact, it's against the law now to land or climb on Ball's Pyramid. You can't climb the Three Sisters anymore at Katoomba. There's a wonderful rock climb at North Head in Sydney called The Fear. That's illegal to climb. They've sort of banned anything. No wonder young people head off to ISIS or get onto ice and other drugs, is because people want risk-taking.
Well, let's just go back to that 1964 expedition. It was a big risk, and in the end, you didn't make the summit. And one of your colleagues had said at the time, it never occurred to us that mountain could shape our lives and could leverage point for the successes that we've had in our careers and businesses and in our personalities. Is that true? Is scaling something like a mountain completely character forming?
Look, it was. I mean, when I look back on it, and it's interesting, I think the 7 Rover Scouts who are involved, first of all, we're still all alive in our 70s and 80s. Isn't that amazing? Because we're all risk takers. And that formed, it certainly had the most incredible effect on me. Luckily, I went back in 1980 and got to the top.
Dick Smith has never been past this point before, and for his climbing companions, the test is now to reach the top before nightfall.
What does it feel like to be on the summit?
To be on the summit is incredibly exciting. It's about 2 metres across. It's just straight down either side, and in the distance you've got Lord Howe Island. The best part, as far as I was concerned, on Ball's Pyramid was to look over the Tasman Sea with little storm fronts coming across, sort of willy-willies of rain. One of the most magnificent camping sites in the world, and I knew this will be the only time I'll ever be here. I'll probably never be able to come back.
So since then, you've learnt to fly different machines, and you've always kind of liked to challenge yourself with different summits. I'm figuring mountains and flight. What is it about distance from the Earth, do you think?
Well, look, first of all, I had no idea I'd ever be able to fly. People think two things. They say, oh, Dick obviously always had the idea to be wealthy, and he always had the idea to fly. No, it was completely beyond comprehension, so I wouldn't have even thought of that. But when I opened Dick Smith Electronics with $610, up until then I'd failed at everything, and suddenly I realised I'm a good businessman. I can make $1. And so when the money started coming in, I decided to learn to fly. And initially it was fixed-wing aircraft. It was $24 an hour. That's so cheap. But I didn't really like fixed-wing flying because if ever you did see something, which was hard because there was normally a wing below you, you couldn't land because there was no airstrip. And one day I'd been forced down in bad weather at a country airstrip and a helicopter came in and landed. And I walked over to the pilot and I said, in fact, he's Chick Barron, he still flies. He was with the Electricity Commission. And I said, oh, is this helicopter, is it designed to fly in cloud? And he said, no, he said, you just fly under the cloud. And if ever the cloud gets too low, you'll land and have a cup of tea with somebody. And if you knew me, wow, I thought. And so I ordered a helicopter, learnt to fly it, and the rest is history. I ended up flying around the world and to the North Pole, and they're just the most wonderful magic carpet.
I've just realised I'm crossing the Arctic Circle. Yippee!
So it was your business acumen, I suppose, that gave you the permission to go and adventure and fly and learn helicopters and fixed-wing planes. What is it, do you think, that made you a good businessman?
I think the leadership I learned in the Boy Scouts. Also, it's so simple to me. I just copy the success of others. I've got a characteristic that most Aussies don't have. And it's interesting, I'm finding that when I try and do aviation reform. My success in Dick Smith Electronics and Australian Geographic was just to go around the world and copy the best, pinch the best ideas from everyone that I could see.
I'm shocked to hear you say that. Most people would say it's because I'm a great innovator or something like that.
Just copying the ideas. And the amazing thing is I'd write to these companies. One of the companies was Radio Shack, Tandy, and I wrote to them and said, look, I have a little electronics shop in Sydney. Would you be able to help me if I came over to America? And people are incredibly welcoming because they said, yes, come and we'll show you how we do it. So they showed me their mail order department and how they ran their business. And I noticed that each company I went to, I'd go to England, Canada, America, had different ideas. And so I took the best of them, and that's why I made so much money. And in fact, in the early days of Dick Smith Electronics, when we were making millions of dollars a year, I would say to my wife, Pip, look, this is all going to change because someone's going to copy us and they'll have half the business.
Did you worry about that?
Didn't really worry about it, but I couldn't believe the money I was making. No one ever copied us. It was an amazing thing. And so the business itself, which, as we know, just recently Dick Smith Electronics has closed down because they moved away from selling to electronic enthusiasts, which is what I did. They moved into consumer electronics, TV sets and video recorders, which I'd never done. And of course, because they moved away from that successful formula, they got into problems.
You've said that you never regretted selling Dick Smith Electronics to Woolworths. I think that was in the 1980s.
Yep.
Do you regret that a once viable business, which had your name and your picture on it, do you regret that that's been destroyed? Yeah,
look, on balance, I'm glad I sold the name with the Dick Smith business because, gee, I've had an incredible ego satisfaction over 47 years of seeing that name and that business employing tens of thousands of Australians. And I will be walking down the street and a 30-year-old bloke will come up to me and say, Dick, I've got a PhD in satellite science and I learnt my electronics from your Funway kits. So that really makes me feel good. To see what happened to Dick Smith Electronics, the fact that it's now closed down, it's gone broke, and it happened because of complete greed.
After almost half a century of retailing, a household name is shutting its doors.
It's what I've been talking about, how you can't have perpetual growth. Now, I sold the business to Woolworths. Woolworths is a public company, so the shareholders constantly push for growth. So in the end, Woolworths opened 300 shops, and that's unviable. And so to me, if they'd had 100 shops, there'd be a great business still going. Because they opened so many because of the pressure for growth, the whole thing collapsed, and that's a terrible pity.
You've tried to change a lot of things along the way in your life. One of them was the aviation system in this country. You are constantly voted as one of the most trusted Australians. If someone was to try and narrow down what it is you do in terms of your activism, what is it? Are you a contrarian, or do you, because of your background, see things in a unique way that perhaps bureaucrats and leaders can't see?
Look, I think the thing is I have to keep things very simple because I'm not an academic. I would have loved to have gone to university and got a PhD or something like that, but I don't have those abilities. So I have to keep things incredibly simple. Also, I've never had a problem in copying the best. And so I think with my activism, it's because I've just used common sense. sense. I often tell people that I'm just a car radio installer, which is the absolute fact. But if I can bring things down to simplicity, I know things like this is a finite world, you can't have perpetual growth. But our economic system is based on perpetual growth.
So in terms of the idea of a sustainable population, you said that you got that idea after having a conversation with your daughter, and I think Copenhagen was going on at the time. It was around 2009. What was it about the idea of a smaller population that was such a eureka moment to you?
It was such common sense. She said, Dad, why aren't they talking at these climate change conferences about the elephant in the room? And that is that we've got more and more people. We have 7 billion and we're planning to go to 10 billion, and 2 or 3 billion of them are almost starving anyway. And Jenny said to me, Dad, the most important thing is how can you do anything about climate change if it is human-induced, if you're going to increase the population by billions? And I suddenly thought, wow, that's just common sense. Why aren't they talking about population? Now, the main reason people don't talk about population is that our present economic system is a type of Ponzi scheme that's completely unstable. It requires this perpetual growth. But everyone knows that's impossible. We, right at this time, are destroying the way of life as we know it in Australia. We're knocking down beautiful Federation houses and putting up high-rising. Our kids are going from being free-range kids to termites. That's terrible.
I can see part of your argument in terms of, you know, every country around the world needs to find a more sustainable way to live. For example, this country just doesn't seem to have the infrastructure to support a bigger population. But where do you actually get your ideas in terms of, you know, physically reducing the size of a population?
Well, what I do know is that you can't use 1.5 times the world's resources every year forever. Now, I do know we could increase our population dramatically in Australia. I think we could easily hold 100 million people, but it will mean that most of the people will be poor. So you've got to understand that when I was young in the 1950s, the Americans were wealthy, Australians were poor. Now America has 50 million people on $7 an hour minimum wage, basically they're on food stamps. Now, why is that? Because they're trying to share the wealth with 300 million people. If we double our population, in most cases, normal people will be worth half as much. Of course, the wealthy will be wealthier because there's more customers. But to me, we should stabilise our population about 26 million and we have a chance of having a good quality of life. Otherwise, most people in Australia will be poor.
You yourself have said that you have benefited from growth. You've also said that you tend to have quite a short attention span.
Yes.
How do we know that you're going to still be passionate about this issue in years to come?
Oh, look, I've always lost a bit of the passion because I've got absolutely nowhere. It's interesting, the population issue. 8 out of 10 people that I talk to say, Dick, you're absolutely right about population. But are any of the major parties or even the Greens have any population policy? Of course they don't.
So are you losing heart?
Yes, I think we need a Hitler walking into Poland moment. I don't think we'll do anything until some dramatic problem occurs, and then we'll have to do and fix it.
That makes me cringe to hear you say that.
Well, that's a fact. I mean, look at what happened at the Second World War. Many people were warning the catastrophe that might take place. Now, that one error then resulted in 60 million people losing their lives. The error we're making now of thinking we can have perpetual growth in a finite world must end up where you get to an unstable situation and more people starve than perhaps are starving now. That's not good.
You have said that you have political aspirations. Is that the only way to create true change, do you think?
Yes, look, I don't really think... I've often said to people, if you want me as dictator, I'll come and run the country and then after 3 years you can shoot me. But to get into normal politics, I don't think that's going to happen. I have put some challenges out there. But to look at the democratic system that we have in this country, I don't think I could be part of that. So I just don't think I'd succeed.
What do you think is different between the person sitting in front of me today and the young boy who was forced to stand up in front of his class and try to say his name, apart from the money?
Self-confidence. I had a terrible inferiority complex because all of my friends went off to university and I'd fiddled with radios. I made a noughts and crosses computer when I was 14, but here I was, a failure, working in a factory, and all my friends had gone off to university. But when I was about 25, my accountant said to me, "Dick, you've made more money than the Prime Minister of Australia." And I said, "What?" And in those days, the Prime Minister got about $30,000 a year. I said, how I've done that? I haven't got any money. And he said, "Oh, you've increased your stock and you've paid your tax and all of these things." And I didn't even understand that. Today, I still can't read a balance sheet. But believe it or not, after a few years, and we started ending up with millions of dollars in the bank, I realised, wow, I'm making a lot of money. And that was the ability I had. And I managed to do it with Dick Smith Electronics originally, then again with Australian Geographic and Dick Smith Foods. We've given over $7 million away, which would normally be the profit you would make. But
that's to charities.
It goes to charity. I copied Paul Newman. He said he had enough money and he was going to sell his salad dressing to make money for charity. And I thought, what a great idea. I'll do the same thing.
I hear that you receive hundreds of letters from people every week asking you for money, donations,
Yep.
you know, help to start things up. Do you look at those yourself?
Oh, yes. I look at all the letters and I can help about 10%. It's amazing the number of people who write to me with more ways of making money. And I have to write back and say, I don't want to make any more money. When I sold Dick Smith Electronics in 1983 or 2, I sold it for about $24 million. I never then needed any more money. And it's amazing how people don't understand that. They think if you're a successful businessman, you must want to make more money. I have to write back and say, I don't want to make any more money. If I did, I would have stuck to electronics. I could have become a billionaire. But no, I wanted to spend time with my family, to go adventuring, to put something back in, which I learnt from the Scouts, and all of those things that I've been so lucky to do.
What's something that money hasn't been able to buy you?
Oh, well, there's lots of things money can't buy, but I'm a realist. Yes, I once wanted to fly a helicopter pole to pole, and I never did that because I realised it was too dangerous, and so I ended up doing it by fixed wing. And my friend Jennifer Murray, who ended up succeeding flying pole to pole, she only did that after she crashed one of the helicopters, and luckily they got out alive. And how's this? She went back and then did the trip and succeeded. I've done 5 flights around the world. I've been to the North Pole. I've never put a mark on a helicopter or a plane. I've never ever been delayed or anything. So I've had a lot of luck, and I'm very conservative with my risk taking. I make sure there's a good chance of succeeding before I start.
So let's talk about luck for a minute. In your view, what is luck? I mean, are you a spiritual kind of person?
No, I'm not religious. I'm agnostic. I'm agnostic probably about agnosticism. I don't know about religion. Luckily, I went around the world when I was young as a backpacker in 1966. And I would have been 22. And I realised when I looked at these incredible religions, how could I pick one? And I suddenly realised, hold on, if I'd been born in Saudi Arabia, I'd be Muslim. If I was born in Ireland, I'd most likely be Roman Catholic. And that just sounded ridiculous because that's the chance of where you're going to be born. And so I've never been religious in that way, except I believe very much in karma, that if you do the right thing, right things will happen to you. And I think, certainly work with me, that there's a reason for that. It empowers you. It makes you feel good if you've helped someone. And then that makes you able to make more sensible decisions and more compassionate decisions in the future.
So do you believe you've had pretty good karma in your life?
Oh, unbelievable. I have been so lucky. I mean, I won the lottery of life. I was born in Australia in the Second World War. I've never had to go to war. I missed out on the Vietnam ballot by a few months. And the amazing thing was I was starting Dick Smith Electronics and making myself millions of dollars when my friends were fighting in Vietnam.
So what gets you up in the morning? What do you look forward to?
I'd love to finish the aviation reforms. It's interesting that I've failed at that. And last Queen's birthday weekend, I was given the highest award, the Australian Honours Award, and they added on there for services to aviation reform. And I said, that's wrong. I've never been able to finish the reform.
Did you give the award back?
Well, I wanted to, but everyone around me said, you've got to be joking, Dick, because it appears all these people had written in and so forth, which you don't know about at the time. But I was concerned that here I was getting an award for aviation reform when I never finished it. And that's motivated me that before I die to try and finish the reform. Do you realise today if you got into a passenger plane and if you flew in with Virgin or Qantas to Ballina Airport, the pilot wouldn't be under air traffic control. He'd be talking plane to plane in the cloud like they did in the 1930s. It's a Marconi system, whilst the air traffic controller's sitting there with nothing to do. Now, I want to make it like the rest of the world where the planes are being kept apart by air traffic control. And I've failed at that so far, but I want to win before we have any more fatalities.
When you look back at your life, I mean, you're only 72 years young.
Yep.
What are you most proud of?
I'm most proud of having a successful marriage, and the same wife, partner, took Pip out when she was 17. Engaged at 18, married her at 19, and we're still very happily in love, so I'm very proud of that, and managed to bring up 2 girls who are relatively successful, not on drugs and things like that. So I'm most proud of being a family person, and I'm proud that our friends now are the same friends from Scouts and Guides of 50 years ago.
Do you have any big regrets?
Look, I've been incredibly fortunate because I've never had to, when you think of business person, you think of them being ruthless sort of thing. Now, I've never had to do that. I was so lucky in business, in my 3 businesses, they've all been successful, made lots of money, so I've never had to be ruthless to anyone. And no, I'm not a Rupert Murdoch, but I've stayed in Australia and I've had this wonderful life, so I can't complain.
Now, I've got a whole... Oh, I can barely carry it, and I couldn't even fit all your books in here. That's just a couple of files of research and a few of your books. One of the themes I noticed from a lot of the newspaper clippings is that you seem sometimes to feel as if people are not paying attention to you or not noticing something that you've said. Would you say that's been a bit of a chip on your shoulder?
You know, certainly I find people take notice of what I say, or more to the point, I'm taking notice of what they're saying. I think it's the media, the journalists, who don't take any notice, and the politicians.
But they've printed all of the stories of you saying that you don't believe those
and look,
things.
I certainly don't have a chip on my shoulder. I've been just so lucky with the coverage I get, and I'm called a media tart. I've exploited the media and done very well.
Didn't you once tow an iceberg into Sydney Harbour?
Towed a fake iceberg into Sydney Harbour on April the 1st, and that gave the most incredible publicity around the world. That was an idea of Jerry Nolan, who worked for me. I've surrounded myself with capable people, and I go to schools and I give talks and I say, look, if you can get qualifications, do so. Incredibly important, because someone employing you is going to say, oh, you put in hard work. But don't rule yourself out if you can't get qualifications, and copy the best and surround yourself with capable people. And what I feel a bit guilty about is, say with Australian Geographic, I made all the money when I sold it, but the talented writers and artists and photographers I had working for me, I didn't have those talents. Sort of unfair in a way that they have all the talents, but I made the money. Isn't that sad?
You can always give them a little bit.
Yeah, well, I've tried to do that, don't worry.
It's been such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for joining me on 1+1.
Lovely to talk to you.
1+1 is available on iView. You can browse the archive or contact us through the website. Stay in touch and leave comments via Facebook. You can also follow me on Twitter. I look forward to your company next time. From me, goodbye.
24.